Democrats running for president face their biggest hurdle on Super Tuesday. With contests in 14 states, the results solidify the frontrunners ahead of Arizona's presidential preference election. As for what voters should take away, we got analysis from Hank Stevenson, editor of the Yellow Sheet Report, Edward Celaya, opinion writer for the Arizona Daily Star, and Zach Yenser, host of Tipping Point on KVOI 1030 AM. My thanks to all three of you for being here.
Thank you, Lorraine.
Thank you for having us.
Zach, tradition, the first person that's new to the program gets to go first. What do we make of Super Tuesday and what it means for Arizona here in a few weeks?
The big takeaway is that Latino voters are going to come out in a big way. They're going to come out for Bernie. But in terms of the real base of the base of the party, when it comes to African American voters who are very pragmatic and older voters who turn out at a greater number than younger voters, I think Joe Biden showed that a very typical turnout base of the Democratic Party is going to turn out. They're going to turn out for Joe Biden, and Bernie Sanders got the majority of the youth vote. The youth vote is usually under 20% of the turnout. And so I think that's going to be the challenge moving forward, where young voters resonate with Bernie Sanders. They don't turn out as well as some of the other groups that typically do.
Hank, you just got back from the Capitol. Democrats in Phoenix saying we've got slim pickings this election. I mean, what's the vibe up there?
We were talking about Joe Biden being, very far behind in the polls, not looking so sharp, but South Carolina really turned that around, and then Super Tuesday won 10 out of the 14 states, at least that's what it looks like right now. So he's seeing a lot of momentum, and whether that's enough to kind of overcome what I think a lot of people see as Sanders's support among Latinos, among young people. I think it'll be a game of who turns out, obviously. Whether Arizona's college students show up to vote, whether Latinos show up to vote. If that happens, maybe Bernie Sanders gives Joe Biden a race for his money. But if it's kind of the older, whiter, moderate Dem electorate, I think Arizona goes Joe Biden.
Just as far as endorsements go, at the Star, we kind of anticipated that this might be pretty close coming into these this last 2 weeks before our PPE. So we have decided to hold off on doing our endorsement until this weekend. It'll be in this Sunday's edition of our paper. And like they've kind of touched on, we've really done that because there were just so many candidates, and we weren't quite sure until Super Tuesday, until yesterday, where exactly these candidates were going to keep going, who was going to drop out. So we kind of foresaw that, and that's what we've been working towards, at least at the Daily Star.
What do we make of some newspapers across the country who are saying, hey, we're going to stay out of endorsements this time around because it just doesn't bode well for us?
So I think what I don't like about that is that, number one, it kind of cedes the community voice, the institutional voice of a newspaper in a city. And number two, I think it kind of falls into the argument against having editorials by saying, oh, number one, nobody really cares what we have to say. I don't think that's really true. And number two, I don't think that the necessary role of an endorsement is to influence people to vote for somebody. I think it's to influence the conversation around the election. And I think that's what you'll see in our endorsement this weekend as well.
Zach, on your radio program, I mean, you talk all about these conversations and discussions. What are your listeners saying?
Well, listeners and a lot of folks around the country, a lot of newspapers around the country are saying that. A lot of our readership are saying, tell me, give me information about how to think, but not what to think. And so rather than just the typical conversation of, well, does a newspaper insert themselves into a political conversation, and do you risk alienating a certain base or not? Some are saying we want journalism that moderates, stays out of it, gives us the information, and gives us free rein to make our own decision. And I'm interested to see that sentiment really around the country. It's actually more newspapers are pulling out of the endorsement business, as you mentioned, not inserting themselves into it.
Hank?
Yeah, it was weird to see the Republic. I mean, I guess it was expected considering how they handled the last round of presidential endorsements. They caught a lot of flack. I'm sure their inboxes were just full of all caps screaming readers because they endorsed Hillary Clinton last time around. It was the first time in a very long time that the Republic has ever endorsed a Democrat for president. I guess given the reaction that they had and kind of the trend in the newspaper industry getting away from making these definitive statements, and even if you read the Star, the Republic, there are fewer and fewer editorials, op-eds by the editorial board. A lot more kind of leaning on columnists, a left columnist and a right columnist to give an equal side, where that used to be more of the job of the editorial board to take these big issues and say, hey, look, we've put some time into it, we've put some thought into it, we've reflected on our readers' values, and come to this decision, and this is why. And newspapers are just doing that less and less.
All right, I want to bring up something that you've all sort of alluded to in this conversation, but you're talking about the older demographic, you're talking about Latinos, you're talking about young voters. Are we at this point where we need to keep painting people with the same broad stroke on these topics?
Probably not. I think that there's obviously gradients within every sort of constituency. However, I do see the benefit in kind of looking for trends, especially in larger groups, and how that kind of affects the population at large. Obviously, individuals are going to act how they feel, how they react to stimuli, but there is something to be said for being able to track groups and kind of how groups act over a period of time. I think that gives us a very good idea of how things change at the macro level. At the micro, people are always making decisions, but at the macro, it really helps us make sense of what's going on.
Zach, on 10:30 a.m., I mean, you have a variety of voices who are chiming in. One of the things that I think is pretty common trend right now are Hispanic voters who are saying, I don't care so much about immigration, but I care about education and the economy.
I mean, I don't know. I might actually disagree with that a little bit. I think what's driving what I see and hear on the ground with Latino voters who are actually voting for Bernie, I'm interested because the political establishment, getting back to a former point, has gone behind Warren. The Latino political establishment, Richard Elias, Pima County Board of Supervisors, Andres Cano, LD3 representative at the state level. So a lot of the establishment got behind Warren, but the Latino voters I talk to are very much Bernie. On the ground, it's very much Bernie. And I think you saw in Texas, for example, Bernie's big Texas win, and he didn't win the state, but his big part of the state that he won was along the border. And so I think immigration, I'm finding, is a big deal. Maybe not across the board, but that's maybe why we don't, paint with a broad brushstroke.
Right. Just quickly before we wrap up this segment, the coronavirus, the COVID-19, we had the governor and the Department of Health Services here in Arizona bring it to light this week. Thankfully, it's not to the situation that they expect, but they're prepared for it. Hank, you were at the Capitol all week. What's the conversation there?
Yeah, it's interesting to watch this public health conversation in a lot of ways morph into a political conversation. We had the governor sitting down with his Department of Health Services director, giving a very long press conference, frankly, to talk about what we're doing in the state to ensure that this doesn't spread too much, and also just a lot of tamping down fears. Like, look, people, as of this taping, we've had 2 confirmed cases in Arizona. This is not, at this point, a huge outbreak, but I think everyone sees that if we're not taking preventative measures, if we're not smart about how we handle this, it could become a much bigger issue, and frankly, could become an issue in the election season even.
The real difference that we're seeing here is what's being said online as opposed to what's coming out of actual media. That, I think, has been pretty good coverage, maybe a little bit alarmist, but when you jump on social media, Twitter, Facebook, that's where you're seeing this amplification of just untrue, half-truth, myths, and that's where I think the real danger in this disease lies.
At the state capitol, there's been a virus going around the last couple of weeks, and one of the lawmakers spoke up the other day. They were getting a briefing from the Department of Health Services director, and she said that it sounds like we all have coronavirus. Like, we've all been coughing for the last couple of weeks. Like, there's a flu going around here, people. Like, welcome to the Petri dish was the quote that I remember. So,
wash your hands.
It could get worse. Maybe it'll shut down our state government.
Oh, okay. That could be a good thing or a bad thing. Depends on what you think. All right, we will take a short break, and Hank will cut you loose so we can get you back out there reporting for us.
Thanks.